The millionaire throws a Thanksgiving dinner for displaced families only to clear his image after a scandal. When he enters the community center and meets the volunteer coordinator, he starts trembling. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Nathan Cole's rise from a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a forgotten corner of Queens to the glass-walled tower that bore his name was a tale spun from grit, ambition, and an ironclad will. Born to a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, Nathan learned early that success wasn't handed out freely. His childhood was a mix of tough lessons and long days, watching his mother count tips and stretch a dollar until it nearly snapped. Determined to escape the cycle of struggle, he put himself through business school with a combination of scholarships and sleepless nights working as a line cook. The taste of hard-earned success left him hungry for more, and once he found his footing in real estate, there was no looking back. Nathan built Cole Enterprises on the backbone of calculated risks and sharp instincts. His name became synonymous with luxury skyscrapers and sprawling condo complexes that catered to the wealthy elite. Each project was more ambitious than the last, designed to draw envy and admiration. But with that ambition came a reputation that was as sharp-edged as the man himself. His boardroom tactics were cold, efficient, and ruthless. He negotiated like a man at war, valuing profits over people. Colleagues admired him, competitors feared him, and few dared to get too close. To Nathan, connections were leverage, relationships were transactions, and the bottom line was king. His lifestyle reflected his achievements. He occupied a penthouse that offered panoramic views of a city he now controlled, complete with Italian marble floors, an art collection curated by experts, and a wine cellar stocked with labels older than his company. Every suit in his wardrobe was custom-tailored, every meal curated by chefs with Michelin stars. But beneath the polished veneer, Nathan wore his success like armor. The fortress of luxury masked the man who had learned to fight for everything he had. It kept him protected, but it also kept him alone. Despite his relentless drive, whispers about his humanity, or lack thereof, trailed him. Nathan was the type to dismiss holiday cards with a polite nod and ignore invitations to charity galas. His laugh was rare, a clipped sound that vanished as quickly as it appeared. To the world, Nathan Cole was ambition personified, an untouchable tycoon who never looked back at the casualties in his wake. It was a reputation he embraced, one that made him untouchable in the circles that mattered. Until the crisis came knocking. The PR crisis that unraveled Nathan's carefully managed empire came on the heels of his latest development project. It was meant to be his crowning achievement, a modern skyscraper with sleek, glass-paneled luxury apartments that promised unparalleled views and opulence. But what started as a lucrative venture turned into a nightmare when it was revealed that the construction had displaced dozens of low-income families from a neighborhood that had once been a thriving, tight-knit community. The media latched onto the story like a dog with a bone, splashing images of crying mothers and bewildered children across every screen. Nathan Cole profits while families suffer. The headlines read, painting him as the villain in a city desperate for heroes. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Protesters gathered outside his office, their chants a relentless reminder of his misstep. The company's phone lines were flooded with calls, and social media lit up with outrage that trended for days. His competitors watched with thinly veiled satisfaction, while even his most loyal investors began to question their association. For Nathan, who controlled every narrative, this loss of power was both unfamiliar and infuriating. The implications stretched beyond the hit to his reputation. Stock prices wavered, and business partners hesitated on contracts, their faith shaken by the scandal. Nathan's inbox filled with messages marked urgent, each more dire than the last. The storm was more than just a test of his resilience, it was a battle for the survival of his image and, by extension, his empire. And if there was one thing Nathan could not abide, it was the thought of losing. The next step was to chart a path out of the mess. Nathan's PR team, led by Lena Warren, convened an emergency meeting in his office. Lena was sharp-eyed and known for spinning bad press into cautious praise. She sat across from Nathan, the city's twinkling skyline behind them, her tone steady but her eyes wary. "Nathan, we need to take immediate action. We can't let this narrative define you." He nodded curtly, signaling her to continue. "We need a gesture. Something public, visible, that shows your commitment to the people affected. It has to be significant." "A donation?" he asked, already dreading the implications. Donations were his go-to solution for controversies. They were transactional, easy, and allowed him to keep a comfortable distance. But Lena shook her head. "Not enough. This needs to be personal, something that challenges the current image people have of you." "Personal?" The word tasted foreign, like a language he'd forgotten. Nathan glanced out the window, jaw clenched. He resisted the urge to dismiss the idea out of hand, but he knew Lena well enough to see she wouldn't back down. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "A Thanksgiving feast for the displaced families," Lena replied. "You host it. It's not just about feeding people, it's about facing them, engaging with them, showing sincerity." Nathan stiffened. The idea of putting himself at the mercy of those affected was uncomfortable, risky. But the alternative was far worse, becoming a permanent villain in the eyes of a city that once respected him. Initially, his mind raced with excuses. He could assign someone else, make a brief appearance, send a speech via video. But Lena's silence as she watched him process said everything. This was the line between salvaging his image or watching it deteriorate beyond repair. Resigned, Nathan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Fine," he said, each word laced with reluctance. "Set it up." Nathan's assistant, Greg, was a meticulous man with the knack for handling logistics that Nathan trusted implicitly. While Nathan buried himself in meetings and pivoted business deals to weather the ongoing PR storm, Greg orchestrated the details of the Thanksgiving feast. Lists were drawn, calls were made, and a flood of volunteers was organized into schedules and assignments. The community center, an old but sturdy building with scuffed floors and colorful murals painted by local children, was chosen as the venue. It was both symbolic and practical, a place familiar to the families affected by Nathan's latest project. Nathan's involvement was kept to a minimum. He glanced at spreadsheets detailing costs and food supplies and signed off on invoices with a dispassionate flick of his pen. It was just another business move, he reminded himself, a necessary step to claw back public favor. The days leading up to the feast were filled with more meetings and strategy sessions, with Lena hovering like a shadow, making sure he was prepared to play his role convincingly. But the actual work, the sorting of donations, arranging the seating plans, and coordinating volunteers, was left to others. Then came the day of his first visit to the community center. Nathan stepped out of his town car, taking in the building with its chipped paint and sagging sign. The air was crisp with the bite of early winter, and the neighborhood was alive with the sounds of children playing and street vendors calling out their wares. He adjusted his scarf, already feeling out of place. This wasn't the polished world of conference rooms and polished floors, it was a place where the stakes were more personal, more real. "Nathan Cole, right?" a voice called out as he approached the entrance. It was warm, steady, and full of energy. He turned to see a woman in a maroon sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. A clipboard balanced in her hand, and her eyes, sharp, observant, and with a touch of skepticism, took him in. Sophie Hayes. Greg had mentioned her name, describing her as the linchpin of the center's volunteer efforts. "Yes," Nathan responded, his tone clipped but polite. He offered a thin smile, one that spoke more of habit than warmth. Sophie held out her hand, and after a beat too long, he shook it, noting the firm grip. "I heard you'd be coming," she said, her eyes assessing. There was no deference, no awe, only the careful appraisal of someone who didn't quite trust what they were seeing. "You're here to check on things, I take it?" "Ensuring everything is on track," he replied, more formal than necessary. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she nodded, stepping back and gesturing him inside. The hall buzzed with volunteers and the gentle chaos of preparations. The air smelled faintly of spiced cider and something floral, and the space hummed with laughter and chatter. "I hope you don't mind getting your hands dirty," Sophie said, eyes flicking to his pristine coat. It was a casual jab, delivered with just enough sweetness to blur the edges. Nathan stiffened for a second, caught between brushing it off and proving a point. Before he could answer, Sophie turned on her heel and walked toward a group setting up tables, leaving him to follow. As Nathan moved through the room, nodding stiffly at the occasional glance his way, he observed Sophie. She flitted between tasks, offering instructions, stacking chairs, and stopping to share a kind word with the volunteers. There was a warmth in her manner, an ease that stood in stark contrast to his own. She made people feel seen, valued, even in the briefest of interactions. It was something he hadn't seen in years, not in the high-powered circles he was used to. Greg appeared beside Nathan, holding a folder of notes and speaking in a low voice. "Everything is progressing as expected, sir. Sophie's handling the volunteer shifts, and I'll be updating the catering schedule after this." Nathan nodded but barely registered the words. His gaze kept drifting back to Sophie, who was now crouched next to a little girl, helping her tie an oversized bow around her waist. The girl giggled, and Sophie's face lit up with a smile so genuine, it made something in Nathan's chest tighten, a sensation unfamiliar and unwelcome. Just then, Sophie stood and caught him staring. She approached, eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and challenge. "Is there something you'd like to help with, Mr. Cole? Or is observing your specialty?" The question, while framed in politeness, carried an unmistakable edge. "I'm here to oversee," he said, but even to his ears, it sounded hollow. The room seemed to pause for an instant, as if waiting to see his next move. Sophie's gaze didn't waver, and the silence stretched just long enough to make Nathan's pulse tick faster. "Right," she said, finally breaking eye contact. "Well, if you change your mind, there's plenty to do. No shortage of boxes to lift or tables to set." She spun around and moved back into the heart of the activity, leaving him with the distinct feeling of being measured and found wanting. Nathan clenched his jaw, a flicker of something restless sparking inside him. This woman, this place, was not what he'd expected. They weren't part of his world, and yet, standing in that room filled with chatter and the warmth of simple gestures, he couldn't deny the pull to understand it. To understand her. But that was dangerous, he reminded himself. He was here to control a narrative, not to be pulled into someone else's story. Nathan walked into the community center for his first planning meeting, feeling more like a stranger than ever. The room was filled with folding chairs and mismatched tables, surrounded by the chatter of volunteers reviewing schedules and to-do lists. Conversation hushed as he stepped in, his designer coat and immaculate shoes a sharp contrast to the warm, casual atmosphere. A few curious glances darted his way, some openly skeptical. Nathan responded with a tight-lipped nod, his usual boardroom confidence slipping as the hum of activity resumed. Sophie, stationed at the head of the room with a clipboard, caught his eye. She lifted an eyebrow in a silent acknowledgement but offered no greeting. Nathan found a seat near the back, his posture stiff. The meeting started, and Sophie's voice carried through the room, steady and full of energy. She outlined roles, discussed logistics, and tossed in the occasional joke that drew laughter from the volunteers. The sound was foreign to Nathan. Business meetings rarely involved laughter unless it was at someone's expense. When it was his turn to speak, Nathan stood, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves. His voice came out smooth but detached. He spoke in terms of budgets, timelines, and expected outcomes, using words that would impress a board but left the room quiet and unsure. Sophie's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to decipher whether he truly believed in the event or was just acting a part. When he finished, she clapped politely, setting off a chain reaction that felt more obligatory than enthusiastic. As the meeting dispersed, Nathan found himself hovering by the doorway. He watched as Sophie approached a woman whose young son clung to her arm, eyes wide and curious. Sophie knelt to the boy's level, her voice softening as she spoke. The mother's tense shoulders eased, and the boy finally broke into a shy grin. It was a small, fleeting moment, but something in Nathan's chest tightened. He forced himself to look away, trying to remember why this scene felt so unsettling. Over the next few days, Nathan's presence at the community center was unavoidable. The volunteers grew used to seeing him, but it did little to bridge the gap between them. His conversations were limited to polite exchanges and curt nods. The warmth that pulsed through the room seemed just out of reach, like light slipping through his fingers. Each day, he watched Sophie move effortlessly between tasks, connecting with everyone she encountered as though she'd known them her whole life. It baffled him, that ability to be so open, so effortlessly real. It was Sophie who finally forced him out of the shadows of observation. One afternoon, she approached him while he stood near the window, pretending to be busy on his phone. "Nathan," she said, eyes searching his face, "we're short on hands in the kitchen. Think you can manage peeling potatoes, or is that out of your skill set?" There was that glimmer of challenge in her voice again, the kind that made his blood hum with irritation and something else he couldn't name. "Potatoes?" he echoed, eyes narrowing as if she'd asked him to recite poetry in a foreign language. "Yes, potatoes," Sophie repeated, holding out a worn apron with a playful flourish. The room stilled slightly, volunteers sneaking glances as Nathan contemplated his next move. Pride tugged at him to refuse, but something in Sophie's unwavering stare pushed him forward. He took the apron and tied it around his waist, its rough fabric a far cry from the silk ties he was used to. In the kitchen, the clatter of knives and pots filled the air, along with the rich, earthy scent of vegetables. Nathan found himself elbow to elbow with other volunteers, his polished exterior melting under the bright fluorescent lights. Sophie handed him a peeler and set a bowl of potatoes in front of him. "It's simple," she said, demonstrating with a swift, practiced motion. "Just like that." Nathan's first few attempts were clumsy, strips of skin catching on the blade and falling in jagged curls. A volunteer to his right, an elderly man with a kind face, chuckled softly. "First time, huh?" he said, eyes twinkling. Nathan offered a rare smile, more embarrassed than anything. "You could say that." The man patted him on the shoulder, a gesture so casual and kind that it nearly disarmed him. After a while, the repetitive motion became meditative, the chatter around him a soft, human hum that made the space feel unexpectedly inviting. He found himself glancing at Sophie, who was bustling around the kitchen with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Her laugh rang out as she teased another volunteer, and Nathan felt a strange pang. Was it envy? Longing? He wasn't sure, but it stayed with him, warm and heavy. Sophie noticed his progress and sidled up to him with a smirk. "You're not half bad, Cole," she said, her tone still teasing but softer. He shrugged, an unfamiliar smile tugging at his lips. For a moment, there was no divide between them, no roles to play. Just two people in a kitchen, peeling potatoes for a cause that, slowly but surely, was becoming more than just a line in a PR strategy. Before the afternoon was over, Nathan's hands were rougher, speckled with bits of potato skin. But as he looked around the kitchen, at the easy camaraderie and shared purpose, he felt an ache in his chest that he hadn't known was there, a quiet reminder that this world, as unfamiliar as it was, held a kind of richness that no deal or polished event had ever given him. The noise of the community center had a way of blending into a background symphony of voices, laughter, and the occasional clatter of metal chairs. But today, it was quieter, more reflective. The tables had been pushed aside to create an open space, and small clusters of families sat sharing stories as the afternoon light filtered through the high windows. Nathan moved among them, trying to maintain an air of polite detachment. But the snippets of conversation that floated past him were hard to ignore. "We had to pack up so quickly, didn't even get to take my grandma's old quilt," a woman said, her voice cracking as she clutched a child to her side. The boy, no more than 6, traced the pattern on her worn sweater with his tiny fingers, eyes solemn and too wise for his age. Nathan's steps faltered. He glanced at the woman, noting the tension in her jaw, the way she fought to stay composed. A memory sparked, his mother sitting on their threadbare couch, sorting through envelopes with a look that spoke volumes, though she'd never shared her worries aloud. He pushed the thought away, his chest tightening uncomfortably. He'd spent years perfecting the art of looking forward, never back. The center hummed with more stories. An elderly man spoke about his lost vegetable garden, the pride of his small yard, and a young couple whispered about their hunt for affordable housing, hope and fatigue layered in their voices. Nathan drifted to a corner and leaned against the wall, fingers tightening around the cuff of his shirt as if the crisp fabric could tether him to the present. For the first time, the numbers on his spreadsheets felt hollow, stripped of meaning. "Didn't expect to find you here," Sophie said, her voice soft but pointed. She stood beside him, hands tucked into the pockets of her jeans, her eyes following the same threads of conversation. She didn't press for a response, letting the silence grow between them. Nathan nodded, an acknowledgement rather than an answer. "They're not just stories, you know," Sophie continued, shifting her gaze to him. "They're pieces of who these people are. What they've lost." She paused, her expression softening. "I know, because I've been there." Nathan turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his face. Sophie's eyes were focused on the families, a distant sadness clouding their usual brightness. "When I was a kid, my mom and I had to move around a lot. It wasn't always easy finding a place to stay. We depended on people who saw us, who cared enough to reach out." She took a deep breath, the weight of old memories making her voice tremble for the first time since he'd known her. "This community? It's more than just a place. It's a lifeline." The words wrapped around Nathan like a cold wind, cutting through layers he hadn't even realized were there. He looked away, jaw clenching as an unwelcome emotion surged. He'd told himself his path was different, driven by ambition and a fierce need to prove something, to whom, he couldn't quite say anymore. But as he stood there, watching Sophie's face soften with empathy for strangers, he felt exposed, as if every step he'd taken had been laid out and questioned under the harsh light of those stories. "You built something incredible," Sophie said after a moment, a touch of admiration threading through her voice, "but sometimes we forget that people are part of the blueprint, too." She left him with that thought, moving to help an older volunteer carry in boxes of supplies. Nathan stayed rooted to the spot, the echo of her words gnawing at the foundation of what he knew, or thought he knew. The rest of the afternoon slipped by in waves of activity, but Nathan found himself watching more than working, listening rather than speaking. He noticed how each story shared was met with murmurs of understanding, nods, and shared looks that spoke of mutual experience. For once, his mind was quiet, no calculations running, no strategies forming. He felt an unfamiliar urge to say something, but every phrase he conjured seemed inadequate, insincere. When the families began to leave, Sophie passed by him again, her arms full of empty trays. She paused, glancing at him. "You okay?" Nathan met her eyes, the guardedness replaced by something raw. "I'm still figuring that out." She nodded, the smallest smile tugging at her lips. "Good. Means you're starting to see it." The quiet of the now empty hall pressed in around him as he sat at one of the tables. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface, shadowed and serious. He ran a hand over his face, the first crack in his polished exterior surfacing. Memories of his childhood, the fear of not knowing if they'd make rent or if the car would break down on one of his mother's late-night shifts, resurfaced without warning. He thought he'd buried that part of himself when he left Queens, trading it for corner offices and sleek suits. Yet here it was, clawing its way back. The voices of the displaced families echoed in his mind, intertwining with Sophie's revelation. Nathan's empire, so carefully constructed, suddenly felt like it was missing a vital cornerstone, compassion. For the first time, he didn't know if all he'd built was enough, or if it ever had been. The sun dipped behind the rows of brick buildings, casting the community center in shadows as the evening chill settled in. Inside, a current of urgency buzzed through the air. The volunteers, who had been working tirelessly for days, moved with worried glances and hurried conversations. Word had spread that the key supplier for the Thanksgiving feast had backed out at the last minute, citing logistical issues. Panic threatened to crack the carefully laid plans. Without the promised deliveries, there would be no meal to serve the families counting on them. Sophie stood at the center of the whirlwind, her phone pressed to her ear as she juggled conversations with local grocers and backup contacts. Each response carried the same apologetic tone, the same dead end. She hung up, frustration carving deep lines into her usually calm expression. "We might have to cut down the menu," she said to the nearest volunteer, her voice wavering despite her attempt at resolve. Nathan watched from across the room, the tension in the air reaching him like an electric pulse. He approached, sensing the shift from controlled chaos to creeping disaster. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice level, though the knot in his chest said otherwise. Sophie shot him a look, a mix of exhaustion and something sharper. "The main supplier dropped out. They couldn't deliver the bulk items we need, turkeys, vegetables, the works. We're trying to find alternatives, but on this notice? It's impossible." Nathan's instinct was to observe, assess, and let others solve the problems they were equipped to handle. But this wasn't a conference room or a negotiation table, it was a space filled with people who had come to rely on a promise. And now that promise teetered on the edge of failure. Something shifted inside him, a voice that told him stepping back wasn't an option. "Give me an hour," Nathan said, reaching for his phone. Sophie blinked, surprise breaking through her stress. "What? What are you going to do?" He didn't answer immediately, dialing numbers with quick precision. As minutes stretched into a flurry of calls, Nathan's voice softened, switching from the clipped tone of business to something more personable, more urgent. "Listen, I need a favor." "Yes, tonight." "It's for a community event." "No, I'll owe you." With each conversation, he called in every connection he'd formed over decades of deals and handshakes, leveraging resources that had never been used for anything so far from profit. Time ticked by intense silence. Volunteers paused between tasks to watch, unsure what to make of Nathan's sudden burst of action. Sophie leaned against a folding chair, arms crossed tightly, eyes darting between Nathan and the empty tables waiting to be set. Finally, Nathan ended the last call, exhaling as if he'd been holding his breath for hours. "We'll have what we need," he said. "A friend from a distribution company is diverting a truck tonight. It'll arrive by morning." A collective sigh rippled through the room. Relief washed over Sophie's face, her shoulders dropping as if a weight had been lifted. For a second, their eyes met, and in that shared moment, Sophie saw more than just a man salvaging an event. She saw effort, care, something real. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying a sincerity that softened the space between them. Nathan nodded, the simple act of being useful warming him more than he expected. As the evening drew on, the center buzzed with renewed energy. Tables were covered with simple tablecloths, centerpieces of autumn leaves and small candles were set out, and a sense of cautious hope took root. The volunteers trickled out one by one, leaving only a handful to finish preparations. Nathan found himself lifting heavy boxes with Sophie, their conversation easy in the dim glow of overhead lights. The silence between tasks felt comfortable, a rare pause that neither rushed to fill. When they sat down to rest, Sophie glanced at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "You didn't have to do all that," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "I did," Nathan replied, his gaze settling on a scuffed spot on the floor. "Because this matters more than I thought it would." Sophie studied him, surprised but unwilling to break the moment with questions. Instead, she shifted closer. "You know, the first time I came here, I was scared. I thought I'd be seen as just another face, just another problem to solve. But I stayed because I realized that being here, being part of something, gives you a kind of purpose you can't find anywhere else." Nathan looked at her, the raw honesty in her voice cutting through the shields he wore so well. "I've spent my whole life building, chasing. It's supposed to mean something, but lately," he paused, searching for the right words. "Lately, I'm not so sure." The space between them filled with the soft sounds of the night outside, the occasional creak of the old building shifting with the wind. Sophie's expression shifted, from skepticism to something more gentle. "It's not too late to find out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's time to look in a different direction." Nathan felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle over him, as if a door had cracked open just enough to let the light in. He nodded, the tiniest smile playing on his lips. They sat there, surrounded by the echoes of their day, knowing that the real work had only just begun. But for now, the quiet was enough. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned crisp and bright, sunlight splashing across the frost-tipped grass and the bricks of the community center. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. Volunteers moved swiftly through the main hall, carrying trays of food, setting out rows of folding chairs, and arranging decorations that added a touch of warmth to the otherwise plain space. The scent of roasted turkey, spiced cranberries, and freshly baked rolls filled the room, mingling with the hum of conversation and laughter. Nathan stood in the midst of it all, sleeves rolled up, tying a length of twine around a bundle of paper napkins. He caught glimpses of Sophie weaving through the crowd, her energy as bright as the garlands strung across the walls. The ease with which she navigated the day inspired something in him that he hadn't felt in years, a strange kind of belonging. The noise, the chaos, the smiles exchanged among volunteers, all of it wrapped him in a sense of community that didn't hinge on numbers or reports. A young woman approached, balancing a tray of mashed potatoes, with an uncertain smile. "Mr. Cole, could you help with these?" "Of course," he replied, the response automatic, surprising even himself with its sincerity. As he took the tray and set it down on the long banquet table, Sophie appeared beside him, her gaze soft with a hint of amusement. "Looks like you're finally one of us," she teased, nudging him with her elbow. He chuckled, a rare, genuine sound. "I suppose I am," he admitted. The warmth of the room seeped into his guarded edges, softening them one moment at a time. By the time the doors opened to welcome the families, the room had been transformed. Parents shepherded their children to seats, eyes wide with gratitude and curiosity. Seniors walked in, some leaning on canes, others holding hands with grandchildren. The room filled with the kind of noise that only happens when people who have been struggling find themselves in a space of comfort, even if just for a night. Amid the clinking of cutlery and the rustle of paper plates, a voice rose. It was Mr. Diaz, an elderly man with weathered hands and a voice rough from years of working construction. He stood, his back straight and eyes gleaming with tears that defied his proud stance. "I want to say something," he began, a hush spreading as conversations tapered off. "We didn't know what we'd do when we lost our homes. It felt like the world had gone dark." His voice quivered for a moment before he steadied it. "But tonight, seeing all of you, feeling welcomed here, it reminds us we are not forgotten. We are seen." The room seemed to hold its breath. Nathan felt a pang deep in his chest, an ache that wasn't just empathy but recognition. He remembered the lean years, the silent dinners at a kitchen table too small to hold their worries, and the nights his mother would mutter, "It's just for now. We'll get through this." He realized that, for these families, this night might be the promise of just for now becoming "we made it." Mr. Diaz nodded, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Nathan. "And to those who brought us here, we thank you. This isn't just food. It's hope." Applause erupted, but Nathan barely heard it. The lump in his throat was hard to swallow, and he blinked away the dampness threatening his eyes. Sophie's hand found his arm, a gentle squeeze that said more than words. He met her gaze, and in the unspoken moment between them, he knew she understood. The noise of the hall faded into the background as memories flooded back. He saw his mother's determined face, smelled the faint scent of the cafe where she worked late nights, and heard the voice of a neighbor who'd once left a bag of groceries on their stoop. They had survived because someone cared, even when it didn't make sense for them to. The memory struck him with the force of an unexpected wave, leaving him raw and exposed. Sophie leaned closer, her voice low so only he could hear. "It makes a difference, doesn't it?" Nathan nodded, the words lodged somewhere deep in his chest. The realization hit him with startling clarity: this feast wasn't just about redemption. It wasn't about fixing a tarnished reputation. It was about the intangible, the connections that anchored people when they felt adrift. For once, his impact wasn't measured in contracts or profit margins, but in something far more real. The evening continued, and the air filled with laughter and stories shared over plates heaped high with food. Children wove between tables, their giggles adding a melody to the night, while parents watched with soft, tired smiles that seemed brighter than the holiday lights strung around the room. Nathan took it all in, the hum of gratitude, the simple joy, and felt a warmth he couldn't remember feeling in decades. He glanced at Sophie, who was leaning down to listen to a little girl's story, her expression filled with genuine attention. When she straightened and their eyes met across the room, he felt a surge of something that made him wonder if the life he had built needed more than just success to be fulfilling. It needed connection, something he had lost in the climb up. As the night wound down, Nathan found himself standing at the window, looking out at the city illuminated by 1,000 twinkling lights. But for once, the view didn't make him think of expansion or competition. It made him think of the families inside, the warmth they shared, and the difference he had been a part of, not just in reputation, but in reality. The chatter in the room quieted as Nathan stepped forward, the clinking of silverware and murmured conversations giving way to an expectant hush. The families gathered turned to look at him, eyes reflecting a mix of curiosity and hope. He cleared his throat, the weight of the evening settling heavily in his chest. This wasn't a moment of strategy or calculation. It was something far more vulnerable, and he felt it in the tremor of his hands as he gripped the edge of the table. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Nathan began, the practiced tone of a speech falling away as he glanced around at the faces watching him. His gaze caught Sophie's from across the room, her eyes wide and searching, as if she too was holding her breath. "When we started planning this event, I thought it would be just a way to patch things up, to fix what had been broken with a gesture. But I was wrong." The room shifted, attention sharpening as his voice faltered. He took a breath, letting it steady him. "Tonight, I've seen more than just people sharing a meal. I've seen stories, resilience, and the kind of strength that can't be measured by profit or loss. It reminded me of my mother, who worked every hour she could to make sure I had a chance to stand where I am today." A few nods rippled through the crowd, and Nathan felt the energy shift. The guardedness of his usual public addresses was gone, replaced by a rawness that surprised even him. "I want to do more than just share this evening with you. I want to help make sure that no one here feels forgotten or pushed aside again. That's why I'm committing to start a community fund, one that will provide support for families in need of stable housing and resources to get back on their feet." For a heartbeat, silence hung in the room. Then, a swell of applause burst forth, not polite or obligatory, but full and genuine. The sound washed over him, warm and grounding. Nathan's throat tightened, and he blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the sting of unexpected tears. He hadn't planned on being moved, hadn't expected the noise to resonate through his very core. Sophie's gaze met his, softened by emotion. She pressed her hands together, not in a cheer, but as if holding something delicate between them. The applause ebbed, replaced by murmurs of approval and whispered thanks. Nathan felt the shift like the loosening of chains that had bound him to a life of cold ambition. For the first time, he wasn't simply the man who built towering structures of steel and glass, he was a part of something bigger, something that breathed and mattered. As the evening continued, people came up to thank him, their eyes alight with cautious hope. A young father with tired eyes and a nervous smile shook Nathan's hand, lingering for a second longer than necessary. "This means a lot," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded, a lump in his throat preventing any response beyond a slight, grateful smile. When the families had eaten their fill and the last plates were cleared, the hall slowly emptied. Volunteers exchanged hugs and promises to see each other soon, the warmth of the evening lingering like an ember. Sophie approached, her expression unreadable at first, but then she smiled, a quiet, knowing curve of her lips that spoke of understanding. "That was unexpected," she said, her voice gentle but tinged with something like pride. "I wasn't sure how it would come out," Nathan admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But it felt right." She tilted her head, studying him as if seeing him for the first time. "It was more than right. It was needed." The words settled between them, neither rushing to fill the pause. Nathan's heart thudded, not with the adrenaline of boardroom deals or the rush of closing a high-stakes investment, but with a quieter, more profound sense of purpose. The kind he hadn't felt since he was a young boy dreaming of a life beyond counting coins at the kitchen table. Needing air, Nathan gestured toward the door. "I think I need a minute," he said, a sheepish smile slipping out. "Go," Sophie replied, eyes glimmering. "You've earned it." He stepped outside, the crisp night air stinging his lungs in a way that made him feel vividly awake. The street was quiet, bathed in the glow of scattered street lamps. He took a deep breath, watching it cloud in the cold as memories washed over him, his mother's tired smile, the neighbor who once knocked on their door with an unexpected bag of groceries, the fear that clawed at his gut whenever an eviction notice loomed too close. It all felt so distant, yet so present at the same time. Nathan exhaled, letting the tension in his shoulders ease. The wealth he'd accumulated, the towers that carried his name, they had never filled this space inside him. But tonight, the gratitude he'd witnessed, the joy of shared moments, and the hope in Sophie's eyes had done what success never could. He turned to look back at the community center, where laughter still spilled out into the night, and realized he was no longer just a man climbing a ladder. He was finally finding solid ground. With a renewed sense of clarity, Nathan knew that this was just the start. He had a lot to build, not in steel and glass, but in trust, in kindness, and in the quiet spaces where people found each other and held on. The next morning, the community center was still wrapped in the afterglow of the night before. Volunteers filtered in and out, stacking chairs and clearing tables, their conversations infused with an energy that spoke of hope renewed. Nathan arrived early, hands in the pockets of his wool coat, watching as the families returned to pick up leftovers and share a few more words with those who had brought warmth into their lives. The atmosphere was different now, lighter, filled with the kind of gratitude that made simple moments feel important. One by one, families approached Nathan, shaking his hand or offering thanks. An elderly woman named Marjorie, who had once been an elementary school teacher, grasped his hand tightly. "My daughter and I were worried about how we'd keep going," she said, her voice trembling just enough to hint at long, sleepless nights. "But this means we can hold on until we find a new place." "Thank you." The sincerity in her eyes pierced through him, deeper than any accolade or business award ever had. He nodded, finding words unnecessary when the moment was already full of meaning. The weight of their shared stories wrapped around him like a second skin, and Nathan realized this was what it meant to be seen, not just as a powerful man but as someone capable of understanding and helping. A little boy ran up to him next, his grin wide and his shoes scuffed with play. "Mr. Cole, look." He held up a crumpled drawing, a mess of colors that resolved into a house with stick figures on the lawn. "That's my mom and me in our new house. We're gonna have a dog, too." The boy's certainty was unshakable, as if the drawing were a glimpse into the future. Nathan crouched down, the edges of his lips lifting in a genuine smile. "That's a great house," he said, feeling a warmth he hadn't known in years. The boy beamed, running back to show his mother, who offered Nathan a silent nod, her eyes brimming with the gratitude she couldn't quite voice. Sophie watched from the side, a small smile playing on her face. She approached once the room had quieted, leaning against the table beside him. "You've made a difference," she said softly, her eyes searching his as if gauging how deeply the change had settled in. "I didn't think you'd stay for all of this." Nathan exhaled a laugh, low and almost disbelieving. "Neither did I." He turned to her, the weight of the past few days evident in his expression but tempered with a newfound lightness. "It's funny, isn't it? You spend years thinking you know what matters, and then it all shifts in a moment. People can surprise themselves when they open their hearts," Sophie said, her voice warm but without a trace of the teasing edge she usually carried. "You did that, Nathan." The simplicity of her words settled over him, solid and reassuring. He nodded, the knot in his chest easing as if her acknowledgement had given him permission to embrace the change. "I couldn't have done it without you pushing me," he admitted, sincerity threading through each word. "You made me see what I was missing." Sophie's eyes softened, and for a moment, the noise of the room faded into the background. It was just them, standing in the center of the place where everything had shifted. "Well, you're not the only one who changed," she said. "I wasn't sure people could really choose to be different. But you proved me wrong." Nathan felt a swell of pride, not for an acquisition or a record-breaking deal, but for the kind of accomplishment that came from something far more meaningful. "I'm glad I did," he said, the warmth in his chest turning to something deeper, something that felt a lot like contentment. The day continued with more stories, more shared moments that etched themselves into Nathan's mind. But as the afternoon waned and the community center slowly returned to its quiet state, an idea began to take shape. It started as a seed of thought but grew with every story he heard, every smile that met him. He sought out Sophie again, finding her near the doors as she organized leftover supplies. "Sophie," he called, his voice carrying just enough weight to draw her attention. "I've been thinking about what we can do next." "Oh?" She set down the stack of trays, tilting her head with a mix of curiosity and hope. "I don't want this to end with one night or a single fund," Nathan said, the conviction in his voice clear. "I want to expand this into something permanent, a project that supports housing initiatives, job training, and resources for families who need them. Something that doesn't just patch holes, but builds foundations." Sophie's eyes widened, a smile breaking free that made her look as hopeful as the families they'd served. "You mean that?" "I do," he said, realizing that he meant it more than anything he'd said in a long time. "And I'd need someone who knows how to keep it honest, who understands the community better than I ever could." He paused, meeting her gaze fully. "Someone like you." Sophie's surprise gave way to a laugh, one that resonated with relief and excitement. "Well, it looks like you're not done surprising me after all." As the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the city in hues of amber and pink, Nathan's penthouse took on a cozy glow. It was a space once reserved for business deals and coldly efficient gatherings, but tonight, it held something new. The table, usually decorated with minimalist arrangements, was set with an assortment of dishes, brought by the volunteers. The smell of spiced cider mingled with roasted vegetables and the rich aroma of baked goods, creating an unexpected warmth. Nathan moved around the kitchen, a linen towel draped over his shoulder as he uncorked a bottle of wine. He could hear the murmur of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter coming from the living room, where Sophie sat with Greg and a handful of volunteers who'd stayed behind to keep the night going. For a moment, he paused, the scene catching him off guard. The room felt alive, pulsing with shared stories and easy smiles, a far cry from the polished but sterile gatherings he'd grown accustomed to. "Need any help?" Sophie's voice called out, pulling him from his reverie. She leaned against the doorframe, sleeves rolled up and eyes reflecting the warm light. There was a softness to her expression, an openness that made his chest feel full. "I think I've got it," he said with a grin, raising the wine bottle in mock triumph. "But I'm not above admitting I could use an extra set of hands." Sophie walked over, taking the bottle from him and pouring glasses with a practiced ease. The simple act felt charged with unspoken things, and for a moment they stood side by side, watching the living room where people who had once been strangers now shared the comfort of belonging. The dinner was informal, plates passed around with murmurs of "try this" and "don't miss out on that." Greg shared a story about his early days working under Nathan, earning laughs as he recounted how he'd once spilled coffee on a crucial contract and nearly fainted from Nathan's reaction. The old Nathan would have dismissed the tale with a tight smile, a relic of a reputation he'd worked hard to cultivate. But tonight, he laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised even him. As the plates emptied and conversations turned reflective, Nathan stood, holding up his glass. The room grew quiet, eyes turning toward him with a warmth that steadied his nerves. "I want to thank all of you for being here," he began, glancing around at the faces illuminated by the glow of candlelight. "This week has shown me more about what it means to build something real than the last 20 years of my career ever did. I've spent so long thinking wealth was measured in square footage, in boardroom wins, and skyscrapers with my name on them. But tonight, looking around at all of you, I know now that true wealth is found in moments like this." A few nods, murmurs of agreement. Sophie's gaze met his, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and something deeper. Nathan continued, his voice softer. "This feast, this fund we're building, it's only the start. But more than that, it's a reminder that every choice we make matters, not just for ourselves, but for those we touch along the way." The room erupted into gentle applause, not the polite kind he was used to, but something that carried weight. Sophie raised her glass, her smile breaking into a laugh as she mouthed, "Well said." Dinner gave way to dessert, plates piled high with slices of pie and bowls of sweetened whipped cream. Conversations ebbed and flowed, creating a symphony of joy that filled every corner of the room. Nathan found himself at ease in a way he couldn't remember ever feeling. It wasn't the result of a deal clinched or an acquisition secured, it was simpler and more profound. At one point, Sophie sat down next to him, the room buzzing around them. She glanced sideways, her eyes bright. "You did good tonight." "So did you," he replied, the words filled with meaning that stretched back through the days of planning and conversations that had chipped away at his old self. They sat in silence for a moment, watching Greg animatedly talk with two volunteers across the room. The sound of laughter punctuated the air, and Nathan turned back to Sophie, the weight of the past week pressing gently against him. "You know, I'm not sure where this path leads," he admitted, a vulnerability he rarely let slip. "That's the best part," she said, leaning in just enough for their shoulders to touch. "You don't have to have it all figured out. Just start, and let the rest fall into place." Nathan looked at her, realizing that maybe for the first time, he was okay with not knowing all the answers. The old Nathan would have recoiled at the uncertainty, but the man sitting here, next to Sophie, surrounded by people who genuinely cared, felt something close to peace. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests hugged their goodbyes, Nathan walked to the window, the city sprawling out before him, aglow with the soft lights of homes and bustling streets. But it was the reflection behind him, the friends, the laughter, Sophie's smile, that made the view feel whole. Sophie came up beside him, her expression content. "You're really going to do it, aren't you? The fund, the long-term project?" He nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Yes. I want it to be something that grows, something that means more than just my name on a building." They stood in companionable silence, the echoes of the evening wrapping around them like a blanket. Nathan glanced at her, the city lights casting a warm glow on her face. "Thank you for pushing me, for showing me that this was possible." She tilted her head, eyes crinkling as she smiled. "Thank you for listening." The room quieted as the last few candles flickered, and Nathan took one last look out the window, the community center across the street still adorned with lights from the evening's feast. For the first time in years, gratitude settled in his heart, deep and unwavering. He was home, not in a penthouse filled with art and luxury, but in this moment, surrounded by purpose and connection.